Welcome to the Narrative-Based Medicine Lab for another NBM Talks episode. I'm joined today by Muiris Houston. Muiris is a physician, journalist, and a member of the International Advisory Board that consults with the lab. I'm Damian Tarnopolsky, the creative lead. Muiris, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to be discussing narrative-based medicine, writing, journalism, your work as a physician, your work in all these fields. But I was wondering if we could just begin, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and your medical studies and career to get us started.
So I was born in Dublin in Ireland and went to college in Trinity College Dublin in the medical school there, and a really good undergraduate time in Trinity. Really enjoyed it, and at the end of that process I went more or less straight away into family practice residency, as you'd call it here, and so qualified as a family practitioner. Subsequent to that, then I did training in occupational medicine, and when all of that was in place, I actually had been working in other people's practices, but I set up my own practice in inner city Dublin, which was interesting because it was fairly socially deprived area, but that was the beginning. Yeah.
And as you went on, you've also had I don't know if it's a separate profession or a joint profession or an intertwining profession as a health journalist, a medical journalist. Can you tell us about that as well?
Yeah, so I was age 40 and something weird happened. It sort of got this huge desire to write about what was going on around me in medicine. And I think possibly a lot of that was driven by the fact that in a socioeconomically really deprived area that I was working in, there were all kinds of things that, you felt you should be doing but couldn't do. For example, it's not very perhaps politically correct to say it now, but back then, it wasn't unreasonable to think that maybe if I could actually prescribe a bottle of whiskey for my patient, it might actually be what they really need, rather than doling out Valium, or you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, I really wanted to prescribe holidays or a brief break for people who are really, often unemployed and living in difficult social circumstances. So I think in hindsight that was, there was stuff bubbling there and I wanted to get out. My dad's was a children's author, so there was a bit of writing genes there as well.
Okay.
So I started writing for the medical press, regular column, and about a year, 18 months into that, I was approached by Sunday Business Post, which was a Sunday business kind of conservative sort of paper in Dublin. And they were starting a health page. Would I contribute a medical column? So I said I'd be delighted to. But then 3 weeks before that was due to start, they rang in a panic saying that the journalist who was going to do the rest of the page had pulled out. And did I know anyone who could help? So being very, very bold, and I'm normally fairly reserved or whatever, but on that occasion I said, yeah, I'll do it. Which was, a bit brazen, but it worked out fine.
Yeah.
It meant I could write columns, but I wasn't really sure how to write feature pieces, which you need to do for the rest of the page. So got into that, self-taught, and took 2 days out of the practice to do that every week. And then, so for a while I was working along, I suppose, co-professions, one was supplementing the other. And then about a year into that, I got a phone call from the Irish Times. Would I be available to meet the editor? And again, being somewhat innocent and not in business circles, he brought me to lunch and he wanted to know if I would become their next medical correspondent, of which there had been a series of appointments over the years. My predecessor was now a managing editor in the Irish Times, and he was coming up to retirement, so they were looking to replace. This, folks, was back in the day when there was still a lot of money in newspapers and the commercial model was working, and so it was a a fairly easy decision. In the end, I said, look, can I come and work half-time, like repeat what I'm doing in the business post for 3 months. But after 6 weeks, I just went to them and said, yeah, I'll take it full-time. Thank you.
Right.
So there we go.
You mentioned turning to writing in the context of dealing with what sounds like quite intense experience of deprivation and suffering amongst your patients. So I'm kind of curious to ask a little bit more about that in two directions. First of all, why writing, and what literary background you had, or what there was in your past that made you turn to that. But then also, if you could tell us about, I guess, how that feeds into narrative-based medicine and the kind of work that we do here at the lab.
Sure. Well, I've always said that in 10 years in that practice, I probably saw the equivalent of about 40 years of pathology. And you saw some stuff that really you'd never seen before. And for example, one of my stories is about the second day in the practice. A woman came in and said, could you possibly do a house call to my husband? And she's in her 40s. And so I figured, well, he's a man in his 40s, can you come down, please? Because part of when you're in new practice, you're not quite trying to train patients, but you're trying to mold it in the way you would like it to develop and continue. And she sort of said, I'm not sure he'd be able to come down. But anyway. And by the way, I had no notes from my predecessor. It was one of those, in the deep end jobs, Right. So I had no information really. And the next day then she turned up after the surgery again and said, look, he's not able to come. Any chance that you could do a house call? And I was about to say no again. And at some sort of intuitive level, I said, yeah, okay. And I said, look, if you hang on there for a while, we'll get into my car together and you can actually bring me home. And I won't be wondering where I'm going and all that kind of thing, because I was new to the area. So we went up, these are fairly high-rise flats in inner city Dublin, and went up a few stairs. And the first thing I noticed was she shouted up to one of her kids up in a balcony, you keep an eye on the doctor's car, please. Fine.
Right.
So I went up and she opened the front door and she said, he's in there on the left. And the poor man was propping himself up in bed against sort of a bare wall, which was, the paint was peeling off it. It was obviously quite a damp environment. But I stopped in my tracks because what I could see, most of all, apart from the fact that he was quite wasted individual, was he had this massive tumour coming out from above his clavicle, thing we call a Pancoast tumour, which I'd only ever seen in a pathological museum. But like, there was no missing this.
Right.
He didn't have to be a grade A medical student or doctor to see it. So it was as well I went on the call, and the man genuinely had good reasons because he was quite emaciated in terms of being able to come up. And in fact, it ended up that I got on really well with the family. I looked after him because he went fairly quickly into palliative care, and I looked after him at home, and with the wife and the family. And it was just one of those turning points for me. And I sometimes use it actually as a reflective piece with medical students. I kind of say, tell me something you don't know about yourself. And that's often what I come out with, just to...
Yeah.
Certainly gets people's attention, I think, anyway.
Well, I'm a bit curious about that, about what you just mentioned at the end, using experiences like that as reflective opportunities in teaching, and how you use narrative and writing and reflection more generally in medical work and medical education. Yeah.
So I teach narrative-based medicine in Trinity College, my alma mater, and I teach classes in first year and in third year. In first year, I have a small group of 14 for 6 or 7 successive afternoons, weekly afternoons. So we have a good bit of time together and a good bit of time for sort of relaxed interaction. I usually get a half hour of slides out of the way in the first, just giving them the general principles, the Rita Sharon stuff and the John Lawner stuff, and just putting it in context. And it's fascinating to get students. It's actually quite a privilege to get students at that stage because they're quite unmolded. They've come in, they haven't taken on any of the medical persona at all, and so and you increasingly we have quite a number of Canadian students actually, and increasingly you'll have students who haven't come from a science background. So one or two I've had who are music background, others with English literature or whatever, and they're great to have in a group like narrative group because they're just ready to roll, and ready to discuss things. So, the big part of that really comes in the second or third week. I bring them up to St. James's Hospital, which is the teaching hospital for Trinity in Dublin, and I get them by arrangement with the one of the medical teams up there. They've identified patients for each of the students, and the criteria I give for choosing the patient is forget about diagnosis, we don't want to know anything. We just want someone who's going to tell a story. And I don't particularly want them to be. It's nice if obviously a few of them can be quite verbal and quite good at telling their story. But if there's one or two challenging ones, that's okay too. So the students go in with that in mind, and I tell them, if you come back and present your case to me and can't tell me a diagnosis or what the patient's medications are, that's absolutely fine. I just want you to listen, and with some prompts, get the person to tell you the story. And I said it's about how they're feeling. It's not about obviously you have to hear a little bit of how they got into hospital, but really where you want to go with this is how are they feeling, how are they responding to their illness. So that usually goes quite well, and then for the rest of 3 or 4 weeks, I have them presenting back in college, and you get an amazing discussion going after that, particularly amongst the other students. So that's the first year diet, if you like. And
if I can just ask you though about that, it sounds like in this experience, the story has a human value that's I don't know if equal to or alongside or around, sort of enclosing or in addition to the diagnostic interest.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't been exposed to yet to how to take a medical history in the formal sense of patient presenting complaint and their past medical history and their medication. So it's quite unique to get at them early, because I then get into the whole business of, you will be taught how to take a history in a formal way, but maybe from today onwards, if you could regard it as it's an opportunity to build a history with the patient rather than take one.
Right.
And that you kind of we go off in that. I don't know where the discussion goes each presentation. I don't know who the patients are or anything like that. So they just present, and then in a nicely structured way where does anyone want to clarify, ask any clarification questions respectfully, and then does the presenter want to respond to those, and then it's so how does everyone feel about that? What do you think? What you've just heard? And that obviously gets into a really good discussion, and then at the end you allow the presenter to
do you have any
to have the last say, just in a kind of semi-controlled sort of.
And do you have any sense of it staying with them? Are you able to track at all if is it just a one-off, or do they return to you in later years, or touch base?
I always encourage. I say, look, if anyone's interested in writing or anything, interested in this area, or Sparks, you have my phone number and you have my email, and please. And occasionally you do get. I've had one or two where they've been interested in maybe researching something, and I've given some advice along those lines. But it's a great opportunity. But the sad fact of it is that it's 14 out of 200 odd students every year, and that's just the way it's designed. It runs along with other medical humanities offerings, which are things that you select into, you choose to be as a student, you choose to be part of. So it's.
I was interested in. I think you mentioned that you have some Canadian students there. I was going to ask you sort of the other question, because we seem to have a lot of Irish participants. How do you compare I mean, to the to the degree you can, the Irish experience and your teaching there as opposed to a Canadian experience or the Canadian approach or what you've witnessed among your peers in the lab here?
It's very interesting, yeah. See, most of my teaching is done with students, and then the peer thing is more. It's a graduate experience. It's experienced people. Um, I'm always fascinated by how thoughtful and not really non-reactive, if that's the right word, Canadian people that I've been on the course with here have gone about their business. But then, to me, it's not being from here, although married to Canadian, there's a reserve about Canadian people. You can't generalize, obviously, but insofar as you can, there's a reserve, a very pleasant, polite reserve about most Canadians. Until they warm up, obviously. But, so that's probably the biggest thing, because in Ireland, you probably get someone, I'd imagine, certainly in the students, and you're encouraging them to do something, but they'd kind of suddenly come in from left field, with something, kind of, whereas that tends not to happen in my experience, and one has to be very careful about these generalizations. But
I mean, I wonder, we kind of try to set up a lot of guidelines and make things sort of safe and protected for everyone, but maybe we don't need so many. Maybe we should be doing the opposite and encouraging people to to express a bit more and let out a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously have you found sort of a difference between maybe Canadian, American, and others? Do you notice a difference?
No, not really.
No.
We're very focused on
sure,
on our little world. So that's why I'm curious always to hear
sure.
from our guests how things compare.
Yeah. Anyway, I hope I haven't insulted anyone.
And I mean, in terms of looking at the world or looking at the field more generally, what are you thinking about for narrative-based medicine right now, or for the future?
Well, will be very much committed to narrative-based medicine rather than narrative medicine, and in terms of the origins of that. So on the one hand, you've got John Lawner, and you have Trish Greenhalgh and Brian Horvitz, who actually published a book about narrative-based medicine a couple of years before Rita Sharon produced her, very much the big tome of the area. But I've always been kind of more comfortable in their experiential type of emphasis on the whole area of narrative-based medicine. So that's where I come from with my teaching. It's if I have any sort of slight bias, and I'm very open with this to students. I tell them I have a bias, a bit more towards that end of things rather than the other wing, and we talk about why that might be and things like that. So it's just fascinating. The whole area is fascinating, and we can talk in a while about how I realized patient stories were so valuable and all of that. But I think, when you're coming from that recognition of the absolute value and just amazing potential of patient stories, that drives pretty well everything that I try and do.
And I do know that you're right now exploring or curious about artificial intelligence and narrative-based medicine.
Yeah. You see, artificial intelligence, as we know, is everywhere at the moment.
Yeah.
It's also in lots of parts of healthcare. For example, in surgery and radiology, it seems to be making quite a good difference in terms of, just organizing stuff to be reviewed. And, at that level, it seems to be genuinely helpful. But there is talk about Chat GPT, which is the large language model used in artificial intelligence, that the next version of that is going to be capable of recognizing emotions and people's feelings, and to be honest, I have a big sort of issue with that. I can't see that ever happening, and maybe I actually don't ever want to see it happening. But what I've done, and you and I have been in communication around this, I've started to write mainly questions about this, and mainly kind of, okay, the obvious thing perhaps for those of us in narrative-based medicine is to just keep it down, keep hunkered down, don't put your head above the parapet, and hope that it finds its way in other parts of medicine and leaves us all alone. But it's quite ubiquitous, and it's going to be quite powerful. So I think we have to engage with it at some level, but very, very carefully, because I struggle with the notion of a robotic person being the one to listen to a patient's story and then relay it back and become part of the medical system.
I think
I just struggle with that.
The way that you explained it, to me at least, that I found I was surprisingly taken by it and interested by it, was the idea that a more neutral approach to human stories might take out human prejudice and human biases on the part of the listening practitioner, or listening physician or storyteller. On the other hand, our biases and prejudices, they're a big part of us. They're a big part of what makes us human. So
and they're part of what the patient and the person has, in front of you. So it'll be fascinating to see what happens. I cannot. I keep thinking, if I'm the patient and say I was terminally ill in whatever number of years' time, this is the way my story was going to be listened to, I just I can't go there really.
No, there's something.
But I mean,
there's something.
Who's to know?
Inextricably human that we look for.
And that's very much, that's really core to narrative-based medicine. Absolutely core to it. So we'll see.
Last question. Just wondering, do you have anything on your night table these days that you'd recommend, or book recommendations? It could be narrative-based medicine, health, or just pure interest for people.
Well, I think I confessed to you and to the group at one point that I was a poetry agnostic, so I've never been big into that. And in fact, if I'm honest, my reading tends to be total switch off. So it's not very highbrow a lot of the time. I love spy novels. I love reading about the history of, say, Europe, 1936 to 1950, that kind of, all of that area. And it's I'm about to go on holiday now, so that's actually the book that kind of book that I brought with me. So I'm afraid I'm not going to come up with any oh, you must read Joyce's whatever, because that's just not where I'm at, But if I was to make a recommendation based on narrative-based medicine, I think I'd recommend a book. It's been published a couple of years now, but John Lawner has written Narrative-Based Practice in Health and Social Care, Conversations Inviting Change. And I think that's a very powerful book. It's a very accessible book, but it's a very powerful way of getting in under the bonnet, if you like, of narrative-based medicine. It's kind of very practical stuff in it. He has developed a thing called Conversations Inviting Change, CIC, as a part of narrative medicine, but it's very helpful, I think, for anyone who'd be into the area to read. So that's it. Sorry, no sort of great Irish authors about to be recommended. Not that I don't like them, it's just
maybe there's one there's one here with us. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Muiris Houston.
Thank you very much, Damien. Thank you.